January 20, 1953, 8:45 in the morning. The White House. A bitter wind cut across the north lawn, and something else cut deeper, a long-held ritual left unfulfilled. The air felt metallic and thin, like the inside of a coin vault. The gravel under the portico crunched underfoot, and there was the faint smell of exhaust and coffee. Inside the Oval Office, a man stood at the window, his silhouette framed by the pale winter light. Harry Truman had not slept well. His hands were clasped behind his back, the skin around his knuckles pale from pressure. His jaw tightened each time a car door closed on the drive, and the echo of footsteps carried like a metronome across the polished floors. Outside, a black limousine eased to a stop at the portico, and the engine idled with a low, persistent hum. In the back seat sat the man who, in less than an hour, would stand before the nation as the incoming commander-in-chief. The same man he had once praised in public and urged on in private. The same man to whom he had once offered the kind of help that changed careers. And yet the door of the car did not open. Clerks glanced at one another. Photographers poised their cameras like predators sensing a meal. The silence swelled, heavy and visible, filling the corridors and the memory of everyone who worked in that house. What had happened between these two men who had shared stages and strategies in wartime for a bond but now could not bring them within 5 minutes of one another? How did a friendship built on trust become a division so stark that tradition would fracture under its weight? This is the story of loyalty, reputation, and the cost of pride. It is about a favor offered on a foreign road, an edit to a speech that was never meant to be public, and a moment of refusal at the White House portico that would echo for years. It began with a conversation inside an Army staff car 5 years earlier, and it ended for a time with a refusal to cross a simple threshold. The origin of the bond was ordinary in its first gestures and extraordinary in its consequences. In the summer of 1945, on a sun-baked autobahn outside a small German town, two men found themselves side by side in a staff car riding over repaired concrete. The passenger was a quiet general with a bearing shaped by campaigns and schedules. The driver spoke little, and the radio offered static and allied music. The man who would become president watched the general with a mixture of respect and calculation. In a voice low enough to be private, he made an offer that was as startling for its directness as it was tempting. If ever the general wished to consider public service, he suggested, the president would not stand in his way. The general laughed softly and declined, insisting that the rule of civilian control of government was inviolate. The exchange, small and almost forgotten, was filed away in memory like a receipt. They met again in Washington, in crowded rooms and behind closed doors, where counsel was shared and favors dispatched. The president recommended the general for a position on a commission. The general, in turn, advised on appointments and lent credibility to an administration seeking a steady hand. Words of mutual admiration were printed in newspapers and repeated on radio. Loyalty accumulated like small deposits in an account that both assumed would never be called upon to pay out in full. That assumption would be tested later when ambition, protocol, and the glare of the press began to reshape both men in ways neither had planned. Yet the larger environment in which these two men operated amplified fissures that had been easy to ignore in private. The early 1950s were a time of anxious politics, with parties recalibrating and voters demanding clear lines between stability and change. The administration faced a Congress prickly with committee investigations and a press hungry for narrative. Senators traded accusations in debate floors. Newspapers printed editorials that read like battle plans. At the center of this churn stood a figure popular with crowds and radio listeners who relished simplicity over nuance. He thrived on exposing weakness and on making reputations brittle. Calls for loyalty swelled in private meetings while public statements demanded decisive action. Advisors whispered about political survival, donors asked for reassurances, and younger aides imagined a different shape for the national project they served. Against this backdrop, the private pact between mentor and pupil came under pressure. Small slights widened when reframed as slanders. Choices that once seemed technical acquired moral weight. The question of what it meant to support an outsider with military prestige became entangled with the mechanics of staying in office and the temptations of partisan advantage. Tensions first snapped into visible form in the communications office. A speech intended to reassure the public and to underscore continuity was drafted, edited, and rehearsed. In a room heavy with cigarette smoke and the smell of ink, a staffer suggested a sentence be removed, arguing it was too conciliatory toward a political rival. Handwritten notes circulated between aides, and the final version, bound for press release, differed from the copy the president had reviewed in private. The change was procedural in the mind of the comms team, but it landed personal and explosive in the chambers where friendship and power overlapped. The public version omitted a line that had signaled trust and a promise of counsel. Instead, the delivered speech read as formal and removed. The omission was small on paper and seismic in memory. When the removed sentence came to light in a leaked memo, it was framed not as editorial discretion, but as an act of calculated distance. The journalist who obtained the memo, Margaret Cole of the Capital Journal, underlined the passage and ran, "The piece with a headline that invited moral judgment." For readers, it framed an image of betrayal. For the press, it became a story about influence. And for the men involved, it became a wound. The first major scene that converted private fracture into public drama unfolded in a Midwestern auditorium in October. The city hummed with autumnal air, and the auditorium smelled of mothball varnish and hot coffee. A speech was scheduled, lights would blaze, and a crowd would assemble under a banner promising unity. In a backstage corridor, the president and the incoming commander crossed paths, along with aides and photographers. They exchanged words that would later be dissected by columnists and historians. The scene played out with exchanges, each line a small projectile. "Sir," said the incoming leader softly, "I thought we had agreed on the language." "We did," replied the president, voice steady but edged, "until someone thought better of it." "Who suggested the change?" asked the aide Thomas Reed, stepping between them like a referee. "It was an edit from communications. Evelyn Hale advised the deletion." "Evelyn," said the incoming leader with a clipped note, "I trust her judgment, and yet the meaning shifts." "It is not about trust," said the president, now shorter. "It is about principle. A promise is a promise." "Principle," shot back the incoming leader, "is also about not inviting chaos into the office." "Chaos," said the president, a smile tightening that was not kind, "is what happens when quiet promises are made for public gain." "I did nothing for gain," said the incoming leader, his hand closing at his side. "I served the nation." "And I trusted you," replied the president. "I put my name on your path." "I accepted responsibility," answered the incoming leader, "but that does not mean I am bound to every choice you make." A silence fell as photographers clicked and the audience outside murmured in anticipation. The exchanges were sharp and public, but they were not yet irreversible. Each line lodged in private notes, each retelling gained editorial gloss, and each silence in the following days grew thicker. At around 1/3 into this story, pause here for a moment. If this account makes you unsure about who acted rightly, you are not alone. Situations like this split opinions and loyalties. Tell us in the comments, would you label the protagonist of this episode motivated by fear or motivated by strategy? Respond with one word, fear or strategy, and add a short sentence why. Your voice helps others see different angles and can guide future episodes on leaders under pressure. Now back to the narrative. The leak that exposed the removed sentence came in the form of a photocopied memorandum slipped under the door of a reporter. The memo bore marginal notes in a hurried hand and a timestamp that placed its circulation shortly after the speech draft was finalized. A procedural explanation followed, an inquiry from the press office a week later. Technical description of the editing process. The communications staff explained that drafts passed through 3 reviews that included fact-checking, tone assessment, and legal vetting. At each pass, suggestions were annotated and decisions recorded in a ledger maintained for archival purposes. The ledger revealed that the final cut had been approved by an assistant whose loyalty was to the sitting president. That procedural description, concise and bureaucratic, did little to contain a public narrative that preferred moral drama over bureaucratic nuance. One of the most significant moments of tension arrived when a private letter surfaced during a routine search of archival boxes. The letter bore the neat script of the incoming leader, and its tone was intimate, offering gratitude and an assurance of support. Found inside a box labeled simply "Correspondence," the letter read to some like a record of gratitude and to others like a receipt for future debts. Its publication in a national magazine transformed fragile private notes into hard evidence. The magazine printed the full text and invited historians to opine. He had promised an ear, wrote one columnist, and perhaps a corridor to influence. A professor of presidential history called it an act of patronage. For the president, it was proof that he had acted in good faith. For detractors, it was an example of coziness between military and civilian elites. The revelation generated a moment of recrimination and forced each man to clarify his stance in public statements that read like careful chess moves. Here, the tension swelled and snapped into sharper form. The 2 paragraphs that followed in public pronouncements were stilted and sterile, but their subtext bled into committee hearings and opinion pages. As accusations circulated, the campaign that had once been cordial shifted into something closer to combat. Attack lines were tested in op-eds and amplified by radio hosts who loved clear villains. The incoming leader, now a figure of national admiration among many, found himself the subject of editorials insisting he choose a side. The president, already weary from the demands of office, grew protective of his staff and of the system he had stewarded. The campaign of public opinion used the press like a battering ram, and personal reputations became the stones. Staffers such as Lawrence Whitaker and Jane Wallace found themselves drafting statements at all hours. Photographer Alan Morris sent images that emphasized distance rather than proximity, and the publication of these pictures seared into the public imagination. Senators who had once been neutral began to position themselves for the moment when allegiances would be called. A sense of escalation took over. Each speech, each interview, and each editorial felt like an action mapped out by sound bites. The second major scene that turned distance into rupture occurred in the communications office the night before the inauguration. The room hummed with fluorescent light and faint radio static. Papers lay scattered, and coffee cups bore rings like topographical maps. An argument about a single sentence grew into a fight about the nature of leadership. "We cannot let him appear as a subordinate in the text," said Evelyn Hale, the communications director, as she folded her arms. "The public cannot see us as divided." "He is not a subordinate," said Thomas Reed, "but the public should not be misled." "Then change the tone," said the incoming leader, appearing in the doorway, his voice low. "Adjust the sentence so it reflects partnership." "We did," said the president quietly, "and someone took that out." "Who?" asked the incoming leader. "Who removed it?" "I did not remove it," Jackson the aide replied. "My note was to improve clarity, not to erase meaning." "Clarity is not the same as erasure," said the incoming leader, soft but sharp. "Trust is not a document," said the president. "Trust is what you practice when no one is looking." The conversation looped into more pointed exchanges. Each retort added weight. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of nervousness. The incoming leader left without handshake. The president watched the doorway long after the figure had disappeared into the night. Several moments of tension followed, which marked the story in public and private records. First, a Senate aide leaked a memo that suggested the incoming leader had privately told donors he intended to distance himself from the administration. The memo was selective in quotations and ambiguous in context, but it spread through newspapers and into radio segments. Second, a press pool recorded a private remark at a reception in which the president said that loyalty had limits. The remark was amplified and used as proof of a brittle relationship. Third, an aide in the communications office testified to a congressional subcommittee that edits to speeches were sometimes suggested under pressure from advisors concerned about political optics. Each of these moments was a small crack that widened into structural failure. They lasted days and left bruises on reputations that would take months to address. The third primary scene was the portico itself on inauguration morning. The weather was raw, the crowd hushed by the severity of the light, and the portico lanterns swung slightly with the draft. The limousine's engine idled. Hands on the car door hesitated. "Mr. President," said the incoming leader, opening his mouth as if to bridge a gulf. "You may stay where you are," said the president, in a voice that did not waver, but that was unmistakably final. "It is better if you do not enter." The incoming leader paused, then smiled thinly. "This is ceremonial protocol," he said. "We have done this for generations." "Tradition," said the president, "is not a mandate for civility when civility is absent." "What do you ask, then?" asked a nearby photographer, trying to keep the moment from dissolving into chaos. "I ask that we do not pretend where pretense is all that would remain," answered the president. "We can stand outside together," offered an aide. "We can make a joint statement." "No," said the president. "Some gestures are meaningful only if they are sincere." The car door remained closed. The limousine pulled away an hour later with the incoming leader alone. Photographs of the empty portico and the sealed door were printed on the front pages the next day. The image read as symbolic and punitive. The loss was not only in a missed handshake, but in the message it sent about what power chooses to exclude. In the fallout that followed, the press framed the event as a cautionary tale about pride and power. Commentators debated whether the president had been justified in his choice. Supporters hailed him for not allowing superficial reconciliations. Critics accused him of petty vindictiveness. The incoming leader used speeches to emphasize duty and service, and to redirect public attention toward policy. The president, now older and visibly tired, retreated into a guarded posture that kept confidants at arm's length. Secondary characters, such as Senator Robert Finch and journalist Margaret Cole, weighed in publicly. Photographer Alan Morris sold the portico images to several publications, and later would say that the closed door became the photograph everyone remembered. Assistant Lawrence Whitaker kept a private diary in which he wrote, "We honored no one that day but ego." Press Secretary Jane Wallace drafted talking points that tried to soften the blow but also insisted on principle. 3 procedural descriptions are worth noting, as historians later pieced this together. The first was how speech drafts moved through offices, with marginalia that often told a more candid story than the final text. The second was how memos could be leaked inadvertently during box moving and then spread through a network of editors and correspondents. The third was how decisions made in minutes by assistants could be interpreted years later as acts of strategy or betrayal. Each of these process notes ran between 200 and 300 words, and when aggregated, they revealed an administration that was less a single mind than a choreography of small choices. There were moments of private reconciliation and partial repair. A quiet dinner at an unassuming hotel saw old friends speaking in low voice about children and weather rather than policy. An exchange of boxed book copies between households suggested a desire for civility. A senator brokered a brief meeting that led to an agreement on a single joint public statement about national unity. Yet these gestures were small and often too late to change how history would remember that cold inauguration morning. The epilogue follows in 3 temporal steps and shows how fallout turned into legacy. 1 month after the inauguration, the public mood had shifted toward policy. News cycles consumed crises and moved on. The immediate sting of the closed portico softened as the new president focused on a legislative agenda, and the press moved to parse speeches and budget proposals. Internal memos show staffers breathing easier, but also cataloging fractures that required attention. Conversations that had been heated became subject to careful diplomatic notes. Advisors like Evelyn Hale and Thomas Reed drafted plans to mend fences, though they feared the wounds ran deeper than any public apology could heal. The president received letters of support, but also private critiques, reminding him that influence can be wielded as force and that shows of independence can become isolation. 3 months later, the echoes had not disappeared. An investigative magazine ran a piece that revisited the edits and memos and suggested the rupture had institutional consequences. Committees convened, and historians began requesting access to files. The incoming leader had consolidated support in key states and moved to fill important offices, sometimes bypassing traditional channels. The press tracked appointments and noted the absence of former advisors from key council sessions. Reputation was being reshaped. For the president, the rupture became part of the narrative of his later life, a cautionary anecdote about the limits of accompaniment and the dangers of public spectacle. For the incoming leader, the episode reinforced a persona of independence and decisiveness, even as it cost him a friend and a steady channel of private counsel. 6 months on, the consequences were clearer and more institutional. The closed door at the portico became a recurring image in memoirs and in biography. Students of leadership debated the case as an example of prudent exclusion versus petty revenge. The administration stabilized around a new set of practices for communications and for transition. Protocol manuals were updated to reduce ambiguities about ceremonies and joint appearances. The press office instituted a more rigorous ledger for edits and a chain of approvals meant to prevent the kind of misunderstanding that had once cost 2 men their public harmony. Some relationships never healed, others adapted into professional distance. Institutions had learned lessons that personal actors had not. The political cost was measured less in polls and more in lost informal counsel. The many conversations by which experience is transferred were diminished, and the nation paid a price measured in quieter decisions made without the benefit of older hands advising younger ones. This episode left several clear lessons about leadership and loyalty. Leaders who place personal pride above collective legacy risk losing the counsel that once made their decisions wiser. The maintenance of power demands not only strategic calculation, but also humility. The drama of a closed car door taught a generation that symbolism matters as much as policy, and that small procedural edits can have outsized human costs. In the end, the story is less about assigning blame and more about remembering that the institutions we rely on are fragile when personal grievances are allowed to calcify into public acts. If this account moved you, consider subscribing to follow more episodes that explore the human choices behind historical decisions. Here, we combine archival evidence with narrative to reveal the costs of pride and the rewards of courage. Share this video with someone who loves history and leave a comment telling us if you think the president was right to refuse the gesture, or if the incoming leader should have accepted it anyway. Your insight helps shape future episodes and keeps the conversation alive. They built victories together and left behind a silence that cost the nation wisdom it might have had. Career achievements and policy successes cannot fully compensate for the loss of counsel and the brittle remains of a friendship that once guided a country through peril. Leadership requires humility and the capacity to hold wide counsel even when ego tempts a smaller, sharper choice. If you were touched by this story, share it and tell us where you are watching from. The White House may be a house of ceremony, but it is also a microcosm of how humans fail and sometimes mend. And remember that even a closed door can teach us about the cost of keeping people out.